I suppose the main appeal of Star Trek Generations' premise is there in theory. Two iconic captains of ships called the USS Enterprise, James T. Kirk and Jean-Luc Picard, meeting and taking down a bad guy together. Obviously, the two lived at different points in time, but Star Trek is no stranger to featuring time travel, and there were multiple ways the story could have had them come together. However, the way it did was not great, and how the movie ended was even worse. Here's what I think the 7th Star Trek movie got wrong. Pretty big spoilers incoming. First, let's get this out of the way. Title of the video, the worst thing that the movie did, what was it? Of course, it was to kill off the character of James T. Kirk. Now, nobody likes it when a character that they're fond of dies. Character death can be ideal for things like drama and plot progression, but when it's done, it ought to be done right. Kirk's death wasn't, for several reasons. And it wasn't even just his ultimate death, it's the circumstances that the movie set up before he even actually died. So, what exactly happened after the events of Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, according to this movie? Well, at the end of Star Trek VI, Kirk retires from Starfleet. Seems like as good a time as any to just end his stories of being on starships, right? Apparently not, because Star Trek VII made it so that Kirk, while not working on a starship but as a guest on one, gets into this event that ends up with him disappearing and being presumed dead. He wasn't, of course, but no one came looking for him for 78 years? Not even Spock, who isn't even in the movie? If Dr. Soran was tracking the Nexus for 78 years, why wouldn't Spock be doing the same? For the record, the original version of the script did have Spock appear at some point in the movie, but when it was looked over by Leonard Nimoy, he refused the role, saying that the proposed depiction wasn't like Spock at all, and that the few lines Spock was going to have could have come from any character. Leonard Nimoy knew his character extremely well, so I definitely trust his judgment on that. He was even offered the chance to direct this movie, but he turned down the opportunity when he wasn't permitted to make his desired changes to the script, which according to him needed a page 1 rewrite. I couldn't agree more. All in all, I don't blame him for wanting no part in this conception of the movie in particular. Dodged a bullet there, Leonard. Anyway, I have a hard time believing that Spock in particular would just assume that Kirk was dead and gone without having seen a body. Given the connection between Kirk and Spock that is very much established by that point, I don't think Spock would just give up on Kirk like that. The original series episodes, The Paradise Syndrome and The Tholian Web, are good examples as to why. At this point in both characters' history, they're so closely bonded that you can't really write one without at least invoking the other. And since Leonard Nimoy had declined to appear as Spock in the movie, it probably would have been better to leave Kirk out of it too. There are also some elements established in beta canon, that is to say, Star Trek novels and comics and such, which would give Spock plenty of reason to be sure that Kirk wasn't dead. One example of this is Spock explaining how Vulcans feel a continuous connection to each individual that they have mind melded with, to the extent that they can sense when that individual dies and their mind essentially goes offline. In this occurrence, he even says that he never felt Kirk's go away. Much more significant is something which appears in Gene Roddenberry's own novelization of Star Trek the Motion Picture, the fact that Spock can directly sense Kirk's thoughts even from across the galaxy. And if he had any of that, you can't convince me that Spock wouldn't practically tear apart time and space to get Kirk back, especially after what Kirk did to bring him back in Star Trek III. However, even if something like that had been established in Alpha canon, the writers of Generations would probably just try to explain it away by saying that the Nexus blocks that connection between the two. Speaking of the Nexus, let's open up that can of worms, shall we? Of all the ways to implement time travel into the story so that Kirk and Picard meet, the Nexus wasn't a very good one. Kirk gets stuck in time inside the Nexus for 78 years, and Picard somehow doesn't? Picard finds Guinan's echo, who tells him that what he's seeing isn't real, but Kirk didn't, because apparently he just got there, like Picard, even though Kirk entered it 78 years ago, and Picard was basically just in and out of there with Kirk in tow? Sure. And they made it so that the Nexus only crosses into the galaxy every 39 years, but it did so one more time before Picard went in there and found Kirk, and that opportunity was apparently not used by anyone to try to find him, nor could Soran locate it at that time. If they really wanted the two captains to meet, could they really not have just done a time portal like the crossover between Strange New Worlds and Lower Decks would eventually do? Having Kirk get stuck in the Nexus and presumed dead by everyone he ever knew, then bringing him out of that just to, for real this time, kill him in the same movie, really felt more like the writers killing him twice. It makes it seem like they brought the character back one more time just to kill him off and not for any other meaningful reason, not even the chance to meet Picard. The most significant character from Kirk's life who was still alive at that time, that being Spock, doesn't even get to see him again before Kirk gets killed. The first damn thing Kirk would do after learning he's been trapped in the Nexus would be to find some way to tell Spock that he was alive no matter what. You'd be hard-pressed to try and convince me otherwise. Kirk would also not be so hesitant to leave the Nexus if he knew it wasn't real and Spock was still out there. I guess the writer's excuse for that would just be that it messed with his mind or something. Now, why did the writers kill off Kirk exactly? Apparently, they felt that they needed some big plot event to center the film's story around, and they decided that Kirk's death should be it. Later, one of the guys who wrote the script said that they didn't want James Kirk to be a character who never officially or canonically dies, because making him seemingly immortal like that would rob him of his humanity or something. I guess I kinda get that in a way. However, the very same guy later refuted that statement and admitted that the movie handled it poorly and it didn't have the kind of impact that they were going for. You don't say. Just because Kirk says that he'll die alone because his friends won't be there in Star Trek V doesn't mean they had to go on and actually depict it 2 movies later. Further proof that the TOS movies should have just stopped after 4, honestly. And Kirk is obviously human and therefore mortal, so he would have died at some point anyway of old age, even if it was never confirmed exactly when it happened. Let's compare Kirk's death to that of another primary Star Trek character whom I've mentioned several times in this video, Spock. The scene where he dies in Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan is iconic and widely known, even to people not very familiar with Star Trek at all. Why is it so? Because it was actually implemented well. After his death, unlike Kirk's, he is rightfully revived, which doesn't take away the original meaning or impact of his death. Permanently killing such a popular character, especially a main character, is rarely a good idea anyway. I guess since Kirk's story was meant to be over with the end of Star Trek VI, the writers felt that they could do whatever they wanted with him after that point, including kill him off. I also want to discuss another character from the original series who ends up in a similar situation to Kirk, being suspended in time and then found by members of the Enterprise D crew, Montgomery Scott, aka Scotty, who appears in the Next Generation episode Relics. At the end of that episode, rather than choosing to retire as he'd originally planned, Scotty decides to continue what he's best at and adjusting to the modern era. If Kirk was going to be suddenly brought into the time period of the Next Generation like Scotty was, why shouldn't he get to have a similar conclusion? Imagine if that episode had killed off Scotty during its finale like what the Generations movie did with Kirk. I'd say that the reaction from fans would be very negative, with people questioning why a beloved character would be brought back for a single appearance just to have him die at the end of it. Maybe the writers thought that since Generations was a movie that people had to pay to see rather than just an episode of a television series, and the fact that the Next Generation TV series had already ended, they were relatively safe from such backlash. Speaking of Scotty, since the film is titled Star Trek Generations, as in generations of multiple people, and Scotty is confirmed to be alive around the time it takes place, he could have had a much bigger role in the movie than the minor appearance he had at the beginning, especially with James Doohan already agreeing to be in the movie, period. Additionally, having Scotty witness Captain Kirk being presumably lost at the beginning of the movie can very well be seen as a plot hole and/or retcon, since the Next Generation episode in which he appears has him assert that Captain Kirk must have come with the Enterprise to get him. It's also pretty clear that the role given to Scotty at the beginning of Generations was probably meant for Spock and written before Leonard Nimoy denied an appearance in the film, as it's clearly not written with Scotty in mind. Another pretty bad thing about this movie's story is how much it goes back on what was already established by the original series and the previous movies. Kirk and Spock had grown so unbelievably close and would do all that they could to stay together as much as possible. Didn't the characters deserve that kind of a good ending after all they'd been through at that point in the narrative? If Kirk was just going to get lost in time and die after all that, it's almost like just disregarding or even discarding it all, especially with the implication that Spock never went looking for him. Star Trek VI was written with the intention that it was the final conclusion of those characters' stories, aside from Spock appearing in The Next Generation, and it was a good and fitting ending for them. It turns out that test audiences weren't too keen on Generations' finale either, and the producers could reportedly tell that they were dissatisfied with the ending. Apparently, they took this to mean that the specific thing that kills Kirk needed to be redone, changing it from him being shot in the back by Dr. Soran to falling off a bridge, as we see in the final version. Filming that alternate death scene actually put the movie over budget, and it was filmed so late in the production process that Patrick Stewart had to wear a bald cap because he'd already begun growing out his hair for another film project. Did the writers ever think to question that it was Kirk dying, period, that lost the audience, not specifically how it happened? It's also all too easy to ask why Kirk and Picard couldn't go back further in time to stop Soran in a way that wouldn't result in Kirk or Picard getting into the dangerous situation that ends up killing Kirk. When questioned about that, one of the writers literally said that they hoped the film would be good enough that the audience wouldn't ask such questions, which it seems pretty obvious that they failed at. Because the studio wanted to get this movie out the same year as the TNG finale, the writing was definitely rushed, and likely why Nimoy wasn't permitted to alter the script, and that was very damning for the movie's quality, especially considering they couldn't think of any other major plot event to anchor the story besides killing Kirk. This movie was also notably made after Gene Roddenberry had passed away, the first Star Trek movie to be, in fact, which could definitely be seen as disrespecting his vision and everything he'd established. He was undoubtedly a very my way or the highway kind of person, but even if he hadn't been, I highly doubt he would approve of what was done to Kirk in this movie. He even said that he considered aspects of Star Trek V and VI to be apocryphal according to his personal view of Star Trek's canon, so the events of Generations would almost certainly be included in that perspective. It's also pretty notable that Generations doesn't have a number in the title to connect it to any of the previous films. With all those things in mind, I think it's entirely fair to regard Generations as at least somewhat apocryphal. On the topic of disrespecting legacies, no one can deny the fact that many Star Trek fans have interpreted Kirk and Spock's relationship as romantic since the original series' initial run in the 1960s. Even with the romantic relationship never having been made canon, any plot in which the two characters are separated for almost 80 years and don't even get to see each other again before one of them dies could be very much regarded as an example of the infamous bury your gays trope. That applies whether it's the writer's intention or not, though considering that Rick Berman was reportedly homophobic, for all we know, it could have been deliberate on his part. The fact that their relationship was treated this way almost kind of lends more credit to the idea of them being a gay couple. And even if there had never been any notion of perceived romance between the two at all, it was wasted potential to not give Kirk and Spock a chance to be reunited after the events of Generations if Kirk had lived. Can you imagine what that could have looked like? It may have convinced Leonard Nimoy to appear in the film after all, like he was convinced to appear in the J.J. Abrams films, if Spock had been given that kind of role. They could have even had Spock save Kirk's life in some way, like what Sarek does to Michael Burnham in Star Trek Discovery by using his Katra to revive her. That would have been a great counterpart to Kirk leading the charge of returning Spock's Katra to his body in Star Trek III, as well as Kirk saying that Spock would have done the same for him when Spock says that Kirk came back for him, and it would make a special mental connection between the two a part of primary canon. If Spock had been trying to gain access to the Nexus like Soran so he could rescue Kirk, it would make an interesting narrative counterpart with Spock doing it because he was trying to save a real person versus Soran wanting an illusion of people he'd lost. Spock led the rescue of Kirk and McCoy in the previous movie, which is just another thing that makes it hard to believe that he wouldn't at least try to rescue Kirk again for the events of this movie. Plus, having Spock, Kirk, and Picard all work together would have been even more of a selling point for the movie, especially since Spock and Picard already knew each other by then. Like I said before, they could have had Scotty join in as well. Then it really would have been about multiple generations coming together instead of just two captains. Call that a missed opportunity. Also, I think there's such a thing as too much tragedy for one character, to the point where any more of it just seemingly loses meaning, and that includes Spock essentially grieving Kirk twice. It was already known to both the writers and audience that Spock, being a Vulcan with a longer natural lifespan than humans, would eventually outlive all of the human friends he'd made. Like Kirk asserting that he would die alone, just because him dying would undeniably happen at some point doesn't mean it had to be directly depicted like it was. It's only made worse by the fact that Spock was denied more time with Kirk, the one individual he'd been closest to out of everyone he'd ever known, because Kirk had been stuck in time for so long. In fact, since the intention was to kill Kirk so soon after he re-emerged from being lost in time, he might as well have actually died aboard the Enterprise B when he was perceived to in universe, because the narrative the writers of the film set up had no intention of giving him any chance of living beyond that. Apparently, even William Shatner was not completely satisfied with the ending his character was given, because there are multiple Star Trek novels credited to him in which Kirk is revived after his death, similar to Spock, and is, rightfully, reunited with Spock and Dr. McCoy. The relationship between the three was always one of the most significant aspects of the original series, and Star Trek V, the movie that Shatner directed, focused on it extensively. He seemed to understand that the three's story should always end with them all together, which is exactly what those books did, and what Star Trek VI did before the next movie undid it. Shatner also described the experience of coming back to play Kirk for definitively the last time as kind of strange and sad, and with that in mind, he really didn't need to do it. If I were him, I wouldn't have. When Leonard Nimoy directed Star Trek III, he said that he intended to make it a story of a family reunited, which is what I think he would have done with Generations if he'd gotten to contribute to the script and/or direct the movie. Even if he still didn't want to appear as Spock again, the story could have been written so that Kirk would return to his friends after he'd left the Nexus and Soran's plan was stopped. Well then, what was the point of this video? I'm aware that it probably reads more like a ramble or annoyed rant than a legitimate analysis compared to most of my other videos, but I wanted to make it anyway. I just had a lot of thoughts about this infamous aspect of Star Trek canon that I wanted to put out there, both to get it off my chest and so that others who felt the same way I did might resonate with it. I hope I don't just sound like a fangirl upset that a movie from her favorite franchise that came out before she was even born didn't go the way she wanted. This is intended as genuine media criticism like I've done before on this channel. I will say this though. We as fans don't have to accept canon as absolute truth if we don't want to, especially that which is executed poorly. I mean, what's one bad, technically considered canon movie that permanently separates Kirk and Spock compared to thousands of fanfictions where they end up together, either as friends or as a couple, like we all know they were meant to? If we know the characters and story better than the actual writers, that's not our problem, it's theirs. They're the ones in denial, not us. As Star Trek fans, we can enjoy whichever aspects of its canon that we like and ignore any parts of it that we don't. The point here, as in engaging with any fiction, is to enjoy it, and we should make sure we're always doing that, while being respectful towards one another about it. If you did enjoy Star Trek Generations for your own reasons, well, good for you, I guess. Let's stay focused on all there is to love about Star Trek. Anyway, here's what really happened as far as I'm concerned. When Kirk is initially lost to the Nexus in 2293, Spock researches it using the same information that Data later obtains in the movie. In 2332, when the Nexus comes back into the galaxy, Spock finds Kirk in there and takes him away from it. Since the Nexus is known to destroy starships, Spock would have known to reinforce the hull of his ship against it. Kirk and Spock decide not to tell the world since Kirk is already assumed dead, and they don't want anyone going after the Nexus like Dr. Soran eventually does upon finding out how it works. The events of Generations can still take place because the Nexus creates an echo of Kirk like it did with Guinan, and that's who Picard meets, who leaves the Nexus with him, and then, dies. Since Kirk spent as long as he did in the Nexus before Spock found him, his echo could be sustained enough that it might as well be a true clone of him as opposed to the one Guinan created when she was only in there for a few minutes. As I've explained here, these speculations of mine are entirely grounded in canon information. If the writers don't have to properly explain how the Nexus works, then neither do I. Here's another scenario. Remember how I proposed the idea of Spock using his Katra to revive Kirk? Well, we only see Kirk die when the bridge falls, and then we see Picard with the cairn and Kirk's badge. Well, what if immediately after Kirk died, Spock showed up, used his Vulcan strength to pull the wreckage off Kirk, and then healed him with a soul graft? As for the badge, maybe Kirk handed it to Picard as a token of their friendship, or asked him to leave it on the planet to commemorate the fact that he did, technically, die there. I mean, how else would Picard have gotten Kirk out from under the rubble? Yeah, I know it messes with the continuity of Kirk's body being at the Daystrom Institute in Star Trek Picard, but I was never really too keen on accepting the events of that series as canon either. If they are hinting at Kirk being brought back to life though, they better let Kirk go through the Guardian of Forever so he can be with Spock, McCoy, and all his friends again. I'll end this video like I always do by asking, what do you think? What are your opinions on Star Trek Generations? Do you agree with any of my thoughts about it? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. I've got others on Star Trek and plenty of other media for you to check out if you haven't seen those yet. Live long and prosper, and I'll see you next time.